Hi, I'm Max Keiser. This is the Keiser Report. Oh, what a week! According to a court in the UK, you can now refer to Nate Rothschild as a puppet master, and it's not libelous. But let's talk about banks and sharks and all kinds of other flora and fauna of the global financial crackdown. Stacy.
Max, well, the banking terrorists have been causing tear gas and deja vu in my headlines. Is foreclosure settlement deja vu all over again? So this is Isaac Gradman, a lawyer who specializes in mortgage-backed securities, and he writes, today the attorneys general of 49 states, with Oklahoma being the lone holdout, announced a record $26 billion settlement with the nation's 5 largest servicers over false and fraudulent foreclosure practices like robo-signing. Good news, right, Max? No. He looks at the details. Only $5 billion of the total consists of cash payments, while another $17 to $20 billion consists of principal write-downs and other aid to homeowners at risk of default. What this means is that once again, regulators have allowed banks to shift penalties based on their improper servicing practices onto the bondholders that actually own the loans.
All right, so for every dollar you make selling fraudulent mortgages, you have to pay maybe 1 or 2 pennies to the folks who pretend to be in charge of some kind of legal oversight group.
Yes.
And my recommendation to, for example, the looters that we saw in the UK in London earlier this year, just get your broker's license. It's a Series 7 license. It's easy to get. I got mine in 1982. It qualifies you to steal, and you have a legal license to steal money. And this is what people should be doing. They shouldn't be trying to reform the banking system. They should get their broker's license and rape and pillage like the rest of everybody on Wall Street.
But again, importantly here, Max, the term is bondholder. In this case, in the United States case, when the 5 big banks do not own the bonds in that situation, the bondholders are shellacked. In Europe, where all the sovereign bonds are held by the big banks, bondholders will take no cut. So this is what he is saying, is that the deja vu in this case is Countrywide. Because when Countrywide, the biggest fraudulent purveyor of predatory fraudulent loans, was caught committing fraud, they signed a huge hoopla deal with attorneys general at the same time. With great fanfare, the AGs announced in October 2008 that they had reached an $8.6 billion settlement with Countrywide, in which Countrywide would modify 400,000 loans. What I soon realized was that this would not be a cash payment of $8.6 billion. Instead, most of that figure consisted of, you guessed it, principal write-downs and other loan modifications of the credits. So what happened is that actually, Countrywide didn't even own 88% of the so-called loans. It was mostly hedge funds and pension funds owned the bonds, the mortgage-backed securities in that case, and they were the ones that were forced to write down these loans.
All right, well, it's regulatory arbitrage, global regulatory arbitrage. So depending on the territory, you cheat the markets based on how you're able to subvert the regulations or lack thereof in any of these territories. So the bond market in Europe would require one set of criminal activities, and the bond market in the United States requires a different set of criminal activities. Net, all the money flows to the criminal syndicates, the bond traders, the money managers, the rating agencies, the accountants like KPMG or PricewaterhouseCoopers, and the regular people get the austerity measures stuffed up their schwing.
But as you had brought up, Max, Nat Rothschild was accused of being a puppet master, and the courts found, in fact, that the Daily Mail had justification in saying that. In this case, the puppet masters are whoever they get away with, whatever these attorney generals or the law decides. So in the Countrywide and the attorney general's case with all the mortgage servicers in the United States right now, because the big banks are not the bondholders lose. In the sovereign debt case, because the big banks are the holders of those bonds, the bondholders do not lose.
Right. And there are billions, hundreds of billions, and trillions of losses generated by the shadow banking system in trading these bond markets in different territories around the world. Anytime anybody loses money, they stuff it into a passive country like Greece that's too weak to revolt, or Portugal, and those people are stuck with the losses ultimately. And we're going to find out what happens when you totally disenfranchise an entire country. Whether or not those people will take arms or not, we'll find out.
Now, in the Countrywide case, so again, why it's deja vu is that at the time, politicians could argue, well, we had no idea about mortgage-backed securities. We had no idea that the banks actually didn't own it, that in this case, Countrywide. Well, there was a huge lobbying campaign. All the Connecticut hedge funds went to Washington and said, hey, you can't force us to take a write-down on these because we have a contract with Countrywide that says they won't renegotiate it. Well, the banks, the big banks' response to this hedge fund bondholder campaign was to begin a massive lobbying effort that led to the passage of the Service Safe Harbor in 2009, a provision that in its original form said that banks could ignore its contract with investors in the interest of public policy. That exact term did not pass in the final bill, but this is what banks want. So remember, when they claim all the time that our contracts are sacrosanct, they are actually lobbying politicians to say the contracts are not sacrosanct if we lose.
Right. As we've been explaining on this show, anytime a bank gets near having to pay off a bad bet that they made or gets caught breaking the law, they try to get a new law passed. This is what I was told when I was working on Wall Street. Break any law you want. We got lawyers. That was the mantra when you work at a firm like Payne Weber or Oppenheimer or Alex Brown, as I did for many years. Just break any law you want. We got lawyers. That's the mantra. And you see this all the time. If that doesn't work, then they put a gun to the market's head. They use high-frequency trading, and they crash the market, as Hank Paulson did in 2008 to weasel $750 billion out of Congress using financial terrorism.
Well, your argument there that you're allowed to commit crimes and just do it, we'll deal with it. The lawyers say that at these banks. The top 12 reasons you should hate the mortgage settlement. This is from E. Smith on Naked Capitalism. And she says, we've now set a price for forgeries and fabricating documents. It's $2,000 per loan. It is less than the price of the title insurance that banks fail to get when they transfer their loans to the trust. It is a fraction of the cost of the legal expenses when foreclosures are challenged. It's a great deal for the banks because no one is at any of the servicers going to jail for forgery, and the banks have set the upper bound of the cost of riding roughshod over 300 years of real estate law.
Well, let me tell you a little anecdote to give you some perspective on this. Back in the 1970s, I was working as a magician in Times Square, and I used to observe the three-card Monte dealers. You know, they have the three cards like this, follow the red, it pays on the head, etc., etc. Now, the thing about the three-card Monte dealers is when they get some chump in there, some tourist with a wad of cash, and they take all of his money, they always let him win the last hand, like a couple $100 after they fleece him for a few thousand. Why? Because the mentality, the psychology of the person, the chump, is that they quote-unquote won. So here you have the same situation. They have to pay a few bucks to appease the people who are on the brink of lighting them up and sticking a pitchfork in their skull. But in the minds of these people, they're thinking, we won! Not taking on board the fact that they are huge losers. It's all very psychologically programmed, and it works it's the con game. And the rules of the con game are well known and established, and this is a con game.
Well, exactly. As Isaac Gradman and Eve Smith point out, this $26 billion deal, most Americans are going to look at the TV and say, well, gee, that's a huge amount. God, we really stuck it to those banks. But they both point out that only $5 billion is coming from the banks. The other $21 billion is mostly coming from Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which you, the taxpayer watching that, own.
Yes, it'll lead to austerity in the United States as we see austerity in Europe. Austerity, as it's playing out in Europe, is coming to the UK first. The Cameron's UK is collapsing, and then it'll move to the US.
Let's move on. Same as it ever was. The Federal Reserve secretly selected a handful of banks to bid for debt securities acquired by taxpayers in the U.S. bailout of American International Group. So apparently a lot of guys are upset about this, actual, capitalists on Wall Street, because they say, quote, the exclusivity by which the process has shut out smaller dealers is a little un-American. It seems odd that if you want to get the best possible price, that it wouldn't be open to anyone who wants to be the most competitive bidder, says David Castillo, head of sales and trading at broker Further Lane Securities. So as it is, the New York Fed chose Goldman Sachs, Credit Suisse, and Barclays to be the only bidders in a closed deal for these AIG bonds. Quote, the central bank switched to a less open process after traders blamed the regular, more public disposals for damaging prices in 2011. Max, you created the virtual specialist technology. What does transparency do to prices?
Well, it would make it impossible for Goldman to play the role of the Pope along with the Federal Reserve and allocate favored pricing to their buddies as a part of a papal indulgence. And we saw that in the Middle Ages. So, no, fair competition, real competition, that's long gone.
But exactly, but like we said, contract law is sacrosanct when applied to banks. It is a terrorist act when applied to the population. Competition is bad for prices, according to Goldman Sachs, but it's the only thing that you can live by.
But Goldman's duplicitous by definition. They call it market making. Their version of market making is heads we win, tails you lose.
Well, speaking of deja vu, here's some images, Max, from Athens. Is that from 2009, 2010, 2011, or 2012? Can you tell?
The tear gas, by any other year, is still as sweet.
Again, the deja vu. Greeks approve Tombstone austerity deal with Troika. So we see over and over, there's a Greek deal, there's not a Greek deal, there's a Greek deal, there's not a Greek deal. Woo.
On again, off again, there's a deal, no there's not. We're German, we're crazy. We're trying to milk you dry and steal the Elgin marbles, but the UK already stole them.
But of course, they already know the foregone conclusion. Whatever it is, the banks, the same ones that won in the Attorney General case in America, the same ones that won in the Countrywide case, the same ones that win every single time will win this time. Here's a headline from Ritholtz.com. I thought Greek dramas concluded at some stage. Well, I responded to that in a tweet. I said, I'm pretty sure Greek drama doesn't end until Papademos has sex with his mother, or in this case, his mutti.
Very clever.
Max, you studied Greek tragedy at university.
I did. I played the dead guy in a production of Aristophanes' The Dead Bankers.
Well, I have a final poster here, Max, Debt Wish. He's back in New York bringing justice to the bankers. That looks like you.
Well, this is a fantastic project on PirateMyFilm.com, legal piracy site. That's me reprising the role made famous by Charles Bronson in Death Wish, a famous movie from the 70s where he goes around and kills criminals vigilante style. Here I'm going to go after, in this film, of course, bankers in New York vigilante style, and cut them down, shoot them down in cold blood in broad daylight. So that's the theme of the movie. You can support it by going to PirateMyFilm.com and reserve shares today. Stacy Herbert, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max.
Don't go away, much more coming your way, so stay right there. Hi, I'm Max Keiser. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. Time now to go to upstate New York and speak with James Howard Kunstler of Kunstler.com. James is an author, blogger, and an urban architect. James, welcome to the Keiser Report.
Nice to be here, Max.
All right, James Kunstler, a crony capitalist mortgage settlement deal has been reached to bail out the banks via the back door yet again. Your thoughts?
It is just amazing how they not only never run out of tricks, but how the American people never seem to tire of being snookered. Among other things, they've snookered the New York State Attorney General into leading a task force for, in his State of the Union message, President Obama announced he was forming a task force to look into mortgage fraud, and he appointed the New York State Attorney General, Eric Schneiderman. And the fact is, we have a Department of Justice and a United States Attorney General who he may be leaking sawdust as he walks down the halls of justice. We're not really sure he's a real human being because he hasn't done anything in 3 years. But the fact is, they have a criminal division, and they have done nothing to investigate mortgage fraud or any of the associated shenanigans for the entire Obama term. So, you know, this is just really a new set of smokescreens to perpetuate what is coming to be just a tremendous control fraud.
But what is it in the American character that makes them feel good about getting screwed?
My own theory is that American life is just so frantic, with people struggling very hard to make a living and being distracted by every kind of, electronic message and show and program and entertainment conceivable, that they're just, the cognitive dissonance, the collective noise in our brains is so immense that we can't really reflect on anything that's happening to us. However, going back to some previous conversations we had where I scolded you for making revolutionary remarks, I'm beginning to wonder whether we're going to get what I would call a John Brown moment. And John Brown, for those of you who might have a fragmentary memory of American history, was that fellow who in the late 1850s mounted an insurrection at Harper's Ferry and really changed the tone and tenor of the national debate about what we were going to do about that big problem of the time, which was, were we going to continue to be slaveholders or not? And he galvanized the attention of the nation. And about 2 years later, we were in the Civil War, the greatest convulsion that the United States ever went through. And so I'm wondering now, when will the John Brown moment come for financial misbehavior that is not only unseemly, unethical, criminal, and bad, but is really hurting this nation terribly.
The revolution in Tunisia started with one fruit seller. The French Revolution started with one girl talking, price of bread going up. And talking about John Brown, one individual starting the revolution back in the U.S. in that time. You talk about the financial crimes, to contrast, let's say, in Asia, in Middle East, North Africa, the more information they got, the more upset they became. The satellite photos in Tunisia of how the top 1% was living got everyone upset. In the U.S., however, the more information they get, the more docile they become. Julian Assange or WikiLeaks giving information makes people want to just lie down and cuddle up into a fetal position and hope it all goes away. Isn't there, again, is it drugs in the water? Is it obesity? Is it too much football? Is it de-evolution? Are Americans now, I know a lot of Republicans don't believe in evolution, but do they believe in de-evolution? Because it appears as though the mindset of the average American is devolving.
There are a number of things going on that revolve around the question of authority and legitimacy, and especially of the news media. And, I personally consider myself allergic to conspiracy theories, and I don't think that there is a media conspiracy to keep the American people ignorant. But they're certainly doing a terrible job of reporting. You wonder why the so-called thought leaders in places like the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times haven't reacted at all to the shenanigans going on with the New York State Attorney General and the task force for mortgage fraud and the smokescreen at the Department of Justice. They're just not paying attention. So, we're seeing some kind of an epochal failure of people in charge. It's like, control fraud itself, which is using accounting by people who run things, namely people who run banks and the people who regulate them, and the whole idea that you are a legitimate vested authority and people expect you to be discharging your duties and doing things properly, but yet you're not doing it. And so there's kind of an equivalent to that in the news media. So we're getting kind of a control fraud of news too. But, it seems to me to be more a matter of incompetence than malice in the case of the news media.
Okay, you don't buy into the conspiracy theories that are out there. However, according to a recent survey, people who watch Fox News are less informed than people who watch no news. So clearly, the Fox people know that if you have a population that is being dumbed down by purposefully inflating the debate with lies, deception, and fraud, that's a population that you can steer by the nose in any direction you want them to go. Okay, now Chris Hedges believes that part of the reason for the National Defense Authorization Act is that the banks are going to collapse and that bankers don't trust the police to maintain order. So they want to give the military some boosted powers in the United States because they see this thing collapsing and they want protection from the mob. Your thoughts?
Chris is a very intelligent guy and very experienced as a war correspondent. And, I think that he's a voice that we ought to pay attention to. I would imagine the problem a little differently. I think that there's just kind of a general level of nervousness throughout the whole culture. That it's not just the bankers, but it's really everybody in any kind of authority is so nervous about the failures that they've brought about that they really no longer trust the system to keep on running, and they're taking extraordinary measures. In regard to your previous statement about Fox News, when I was a young newspaper reporter, I investigated religious cults and political cults, and one of the things that impressed me tremendously was how a group of people could simply subscribe to a bundle of ideas or shall we say programming, and then their whole mental program was then set, and they didn't really have to review any of their beliefs. And I think that that's happened to a tremendous extent now in our culture.
Right, so you've got Bill O'Reilly is more like Charles Manson than Edward R. Murrow. Now, let's talk about something you're very keen to write about and talk about over the years, peak resources. And I want to ask you, is there any connection between the curtailment of civil liberties in the U.S. and this peak resource, the peak oil, peak water, et cetera?
Well, there's certainly a connection between all of these enormous looming issues. The failure of capital finance, the failure of civil order and the faith that we can run a civil society, and the availability of the vital resources that we need to have an economy that continues to grow and produce the ability to do things like service debt. So yes, these things are all intimately connected, and they all end up redounding into the question of whether or not this is a society that has enough confidence that it will be able to keep going and carrying this project of civilization into the future. Right now, we're not too sure about that.
All right, James Kumsler, here's another curious thing. There's a Washington Post showed that with a Democrat in office, the anti-war movement, made up mostly of Democrats, has declined drastically. They are apparently fine with the wars while they team up, while their team is in, so to speak. What's that all about?
It probably, again, a question of authority. If you identify yourself as a Democrat or a progressive and your party is carrying out the wars and doing it in a way that, there's no draft, so people aren't being dragged off to, against their will, they're volunteering. And in fact, it's really kind of a job center for that disappearing cohort of young men, especially, who need to work with their hands and can't go to work in a factory or do some kind of, or any longer, build houses or do other construction jobs. So, they work with their hands killing people in other lands. So, probably it's regarded as a kind of a jobs program.
Right. Well, and of course, when they go to these wars, they often lose their hands. And then Goldman Sachs creates hand commoditized and collateralized futures contracts that they trade with other banks, and they profit in another way on the death and misery of poor U.S. servicemen sent to do Goldman Sachs' dirty work. Okay, there's another war, the ongoing financial war, and once again, strangely, the Democratic voters don't mind financial crimes because their guy, Obama's in office, so somehow, like when I listen to Bill Maher on HBO, no matter what financial crime is committed, he reparrots the same stupidity that comes out of the White House about how the bailouts are profitable, how the auto companies are doing fantastically well. And so these liberals, so-called, just because they have their guy in office, they don't seem to understand what a financial crime is. Well, is it just financial illiteracy on that Huffington Post side of the aisle?
I don't think so. And I think it's certainly all parts of the political spectrum. Thomas Frank wrote a book a few years ago called What's the Matter with Kansas? And the basic point of his book was, why do voters get snookered by political parties into voting against their own interests? But the situation's changed now a few years later. And what we're seeing is something a lot worse than that. What we're seeing is now a comprehensive failure of leadership, and not just in politics, which is the most visible kind of leadership, but comprehensively through American life, and to some extent Western life. A failure of leadership in politics, business, in the media, in the clergy, in education, at every level. And that makes for a very nervous society.
All right, James Howard Kunstler, we're out of time. Thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Quite welcome, Max. Always a pleasure.
All right, and that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I want to thank my guest, James Howard Kunstler. You can find Howard Kunstler at kunstler.com. If you'd like to send me an email, please do so at keiserreport@rttv.ru, or you can follow me on Twitter. Until next time, Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.